Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. And tonight we're happy to host Kevin Tolan from the Vermont Center for Ecostudies to talk to us about grassland birds. Kevin focuses on sort of vernal pools, and then he moves into the grassland bird management and reaching out and sharing about both of those types of management and locations. Before I turn it over to Kevin, let me go through a few quick housekeeping things. The first is that you're welcome to have your cameras on or off. That's up to you. Please do mute yourself so that there's no interruptions. At the end, we'll take questions. It's a small group, so we may be able to take them just, you can ask them or you can type them in the chat, whichever you prefer. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin and let him start the program.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me make sure my screen shared. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for having me. We've collaborated a couple times. We did vernal pool stuff last year, doing some grassland bird stuff this year. So it's been great building this relationship between organizations. If you're not familiar with the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, we are a nonprofit headquartered in Norwich, right on the White River Junction town line. Some of our most well-known projects are common loon conservation. We've done a lot with bees and butterflies. Of course, I do some vernal pool work. But today we're going to focus on grassland birds. Just a little background on grassland birds, which is not really too Vermont specific at the moment. But just in general, when we think of grasslands, we think of these quote unquote native grasslands. A lot of these are sustained through fire. The Rocky Mountains come right through here, and so some of them are also part of the rain shadow of the Rockies. And they are very diverse native ecosystems that have just been absolutely ravaged through development and agriculture. This map shows the amount of the grassland biome, primarily the tall grass and short grass prairies. And just so much of it, all the red, 62% is lost. And if you go back to this previous map, you'll see a lot of that is this tall grass and mixed grass prairie. That's really good for agriculture. It's relatively wet compared to the short grass prairie. And so a lot of the prairie biome has been lost throughout the country and frankly throughout the world. And we really see this in bird declines. This is the number of birds since 1960s, the population trends. And see at the right at the bottom here, grassland birds and arid land birds, which are like desert species, are some of the are the quickest declining species. In the country, outside of the birds that are endemic to Hawaii and are really doing have either gone extinct or are really doing poorly, grassland birds are the next quickest declining group. But this also doesn't tell the full story. Because if you look at a map of where we have planted grasslands, you start to see a lot more habitat pop up. The blue and teal is the intact, quote unquote, natural grasslands. And then all this orange and mostly the yellow is the planted grasslands. And so that's what we currently have in Vermont. Most of our grasslands have been planted primarily for agriculture, dairy, sheep, things like that. And when we think of Vermont's grasslands, we can think of them in some sense as being analogous to the ones here. We're at like a similar latitude. We have a similar precipitation regime. And so when we think about our birds, the birds that we have are pretty similar to the ones they have in this mixed prairie tall grass region. And just to specify what I'm talking about when I say a grassland bird, there are a lot of birds that are adjacent to grasslands that people really associate with agriculture. Things like bluebirds and kestrels and tree swallows, which nest in boxes that people put out, phoebes and barn swallows nesting barns and under overhangs. So these are all associated with grasslands, but they don't nest on the ground in grasslands. So when you go and you hay your field, you're not directly destroying the nests of these species. The grassland obligate birds, the ones that nest on the ground, are the ones that we call the grassland birds. And so that's species like bobolink, eastern meadowlark, and savanna sparrow, which are the ones that most people are going to be familiar with. Many of our grassland birds, as you see here, are either threatened or endangered. Some species, like the Henslow sparrow, probably hasn't nested here since the 1970s. Upland sandpiper, we only have like two nesting pairs left in the entire state. And just as a whole, grassland birds throughout the entire Northeast really take up large portions of our threatened and endangered species lists. And just a sense of what a grassland habitat looks like, you're really looking for a pristine hayfield, the exact type of things that a dairy farmer might want. So it's dominated by grass, well over 50% grass, and you usually pretty big and wide open. A lot of people might have smaller fields that are a couple acres that are filled with wildflowers or maybe a mix of grass and flowers. And I would consider that more of like a meadow than a grassland. A grassland really is a specific type of environment. And the poster child for grassland bird conservation in Vermont, what we call an umbrella species, are bobolink. Bobolink are still somewhat common in Vermont. You can find them in many hayfields as long as they are managed in a proper way, which we'll obviously discuss later. They have really long migrations, so they kind of connect the hemisphere and provide really good excuse almost to conserve migratory birds and work with partners across the hemispheres to conserve not just bobolink, but also warblers and other migratory species. And when you conserve bobolink habitat, in general, you're conserving habitat for the other grassland bird species. So if you have bobolink, you also probably have like savanna sparrow. They're also really distinctive, so people can understand them, identify them, and as such, they're pretty charismatic. Their breeding range pretty much straddles the US-Canada border. It's really heaviest in that prairie pothole tall grass region. But over here near Lake Erie and up through the Northeast, there's also a lot of available habitat now that has been cleared out. And in Vermont, this is a map of our hayfields and pastures. And you can see, obviously, Champlain Valley is where most of the habitat is. But there are also other bits throughout the state. This has declined very much in the past 100 years. But that's just kind of the reforestation trend that Vermont's on. And so right off the bat, I'm going to get into a question that I think a lot of people might have. Why bother conserving grassland habitat in Vermont? I get this question all the time, and it is a very good question. And my answer pretty much boils down to this map right here. This is from, we call it a full life cycle conservation plan of bobolink. So it was a massive undertaking trying to make a life cycle, a full year-round conservation plan that spans the hemispheres to conserve bobolinks, both on the breeding ground and the wintering ground and during migration. And this is a map that was produced, takes into account things like the current amount of bobolinks in a region and the current amount of bobolinks relative to other regions. So in this case, it'd be like the number of bobolinks in Franklin County and the number of bobolinks in Chittenden and neighboring counties. It also takes into account a lot of climatic variables. And when you factor these all in, the areas in blue have the highest potential for grassland bird conservation over the next 100 years. So when we're thinking about bird conservation, we can't just be thinking about returning the landscape to what it used to be, because things really are changing. And I'm not advocating to cut down forests to create grassland bird habitat, but I think we are always going to have grassland habitat in Vermont. It's one of the reasons people love driving down Route 7. It's a big part of Vermont's identity. And so if we're going to have grasslands and we're expected to be a great place for grassland birds, I think it's kind of on us to try and manage that grassland responsibly. And just to build off this a little bit, we bobolinks are expected to be severely impacted by climate change, not just bobolinks, but also their habitat. Grasslands are really sensitive to climate change. There's no large water bodies, so they can't really have that kind of climate regulation you might have near a heat sink. There's grasses are very short-lived, so it can be a really quick turnover in terms of the grasses that are present and what might be there in 5 years. And so this is from National Audubon, basically under imminent climatic change, which is an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, all this red region is expected to become much less suitable for grassland birds. That might be because the precipitation changes, so it stops being a tall grass prairie and goes short grass. It might be because these are really areas that might be transformed into a lot of agriculture and we'll lose more grassland habitat there. Um, you look at Vermont, we're expected to retain a good amount of our habitat. And then look at Canada, they're in theory expected to gain a ton of habitat. But if you think about what type of habitat is here currently, you're looking at a ton of trees. And so just because the climate is shifting doesn't mean there's magically going to be new habitat for these birds. And so in Vermont, we already have habitat. We need to conserve it for the next 100 years so that as this approaches, we'll have habitat to provide birds to breed in. Here's a look at what the bobolink chicks look like. They build their nests right on the ground, built into grasses. The grasses are really important to hide the nest. That's really their only defense is hiding their nest well. So they come here, they breed, really only have one nest per year. They have to migrate so far that if they have a nest failure sometime in maybe mid-June, they're not going to even bother trying to re-nest because they know their offspring won't have enough time to prepare for southbound migration. So these are really sensitive to having even one nest destroyed, which is another reason why agriculture can be so damaging to them. And then just a sense of where they winter way down in South America. So this is from some tracking we've done at Vermont Center for Ecostudies and some other partners like University of New England. These are regions where the bobolinks overwinter. Most overwinter down here in Argentina, Paraguay. A couple, around a quarter of them perhaps, overwinter here in Bolivia. And they overwinter in rice paddies and other rice and cereal and grass wetlands, especially like wetter areas, whereas up here they're in the hay fields. Just to look at how big some of these flocks get during the winter. This is a video from 2006. Hopefully it comes through okay. This is, not the best camera quality back then. But if you look at these massive flocks, these are about 90,000 bobolinks all flying by. And so up here, they're very territorial, but on their wintering grounds, they form these large flocks. Another grassland bird that people might be somewhat familiar with are eastern meadowlarks. Eastern meadowlarks are really similar, same type of habitat as bobolinks, but they have a very different distribution. They have about the entire eastern half of the US where they tend to breed and overwinter. And then on the western half of the US, there's a western meadowlark, which is a closely related sister species. They have over 10 subspecies. They have a population in Cuba, population throughout South America and Central America. And the ones we have up in Vermont are migratory. Eastern meadowlarks have declined by about 75% since the 1960s. So they're by far one of the quickest declining species that we see. And just that goes along with this grassland bird habitat being lost. If you map out the trends of eastern meadowlarks, some portions like throughout New England, they're declining by over 7% per year. And that's happening throughout almost all of their range. There's a couple portions where maybe they're increasing, but the vast majority they're declining. Now in Vermont, we have less than 100 breeding individuals left. And this is a project that I coordinate for VCE. All these orange dots are observations that were submitted to us of eastern meadowlarks. And then from those and observations, we determine where they likely bred. So all the black dots are areas where they bred in both 2024 and 2025. And then the blue and red dots are whether we lost or gained the site between there. But this is less than 50 individual sites, and each sites mainly only have one nesting pair because they're so territorial. So this is a species that's really rapidly declining and is hyper localized now. Again, as you see with grasslands, mostly centered in the Champlain Valley, but there are also some isolated sites in some of the other historic agriculture regions. This is a project that we've worked on with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. We deployed some GPS tracking units on some eastern meadowlark, two in Charlotte and one up in Swanton, and tracked where they overwintered. And it seems like they overwinter mostly in the mid-Atlantic and like Long Island. So this gives us some great information to try and conserve these birds when they're not breeding here. They're only here for less than half the year, so it's important to consider where they're overwintering to make sure that our birds are surviving the winter. When you go and look at where these birds overwintered, a lot of them are agriculture fields. And so if those fields are maybe using neonicotinoid covered seeds or are being managed in a way that might damage the or reduce the survival of eastern meadowlarks, that would be directly impacting our population. And just a third species I'll mention real quickly is savanna sparrow. This species is not as much of a concern as bobolink and eastern meadowlark. They seem much more ready to renest. One was documented trying to renest 5 times in a season after nests were either destroyed or predated. So they have a somewhat stable population in Vermont, it looks like, but because they are out in grasslands with bobolinks, they're great indicator species for that grassland habitat. One thing that makes grassland birds so difficult to manage for is their size requirements. This is down here in the bottom left, you see a tiny American football field. And in general, we think of bobolinks as requiring at least 10 acres to nest. You could get smaller if you have a circular or square-shaped field that has a lot of interior space. You could maybe get a little bit smaller. For the most part, 10 acres is a good minimum value for whether or not you will have grassland birds. And then other species, like you see upland sandpiper, require even larger areas. And this might be one of the reasons why we've lost some of these species. As our grasslands have gotten more fragmented, they're just less suitable for nesting habitat. And the main reason these birds are in these large fields and like to be as close to the middle as possible is they really care about the landscape openness. So that's one take-home message, that the openness really drives the occupancy of birds within grasslands to some extent. The birds really like being far from the edge, and they like having an unobstructed view. So if you have a hedgerow that cuts a 100-acre hayfield in half, you don't have a 100-acre hayfield, you have two 50-acre hayfields. Something like a road that's not visible, like a dirt road, might not have that same impact on the nest placement, but something like a hedgerow where predators might be, or a bird of prey could perch up on to try and predate you, that's where they really seem to avoid. And this metric called openness kind of combines both of those. If you look out into the horizon, you can imagine a 90-degree right angle. And basically they want like 70 or 80 of those degrees to be open to the horizon. And so if you're on a slight hilltop where it's really open to the horizon, like here, this would be considered very good habitat where they would likely put a nest because it feels so open to the horizon, whereas a smaller field feels a little more enclosed in and has less of an openness. Here's an example in practice. This is a farm in Norwich. This is obviously during the winter. It's a slight hill. You can't really see it, but it's pretty wide, and this is a great bobolink site. If you go and look at it from satellite imagery, on the left here, this is 1 acre, so it's probably about 20 acres in size. This is a 3D rendering of the landscape. So you can even see there's a little tree here. The grayer areas mean higher elevation. So as you get down lower, it gets to be lower elevation, and you can see the hill coming up. And then getting the openness, which takes that hill and the distance to edge into factor, you can really see this internal area here is going to be the most suitable for the birds. Even though on the left here, it is still pretty open, or still relatively largish field, the openness isn't as high. And so this would definitely be less suitable habitat or less attractive habitat for the birds. Now, what do you do to conserve the birds? Bobolinks are most threatened on their breeding habitat. A lot of species have a lot of threats throughout their entire year. Some species are more threatened by habitat loss down in the Caribbean or in Central South America. But bobolinks are really most threatened up here in their breeding areas. So it gives us a great opportunity to conserve them. First, you have to understand the breeding phenology of the birds. Their peak breeding period is June through July. They return in May, begin building nests and establishing territories. By June, they have nests and they're incubating. The hatchlings, the nestlings hatch, stay in the nest for a couple more weeks, and then disperse. And when they leave the nest, when they fledge, they are not able to fly. So they also do rely on their parents for some protection and feeding upon leaving the nest. And just a timeline of how long that is. It's about a month. Takes a couple days for nest building and egg laying. This blue bit is incubation. Another little bit for the nestlings to be fed. They leave the nest and then they take about a week to be able to actually fly to avoid farm machinery. And then for the next couple weeks, they are still fed by their parents as they're starting to flock up. But you can imagine about a month, 31 days is like a minimum time it really takes to start from building a nest to fledging young. Now you can imagine that is an issue in agriculture when there's an incentive to manage more frequently than that. After about a month, the nutrient quality in some forages really starts declining. This is alfalfa, which is not a grass, but it's commonly mixed in with hay fields and is also sometimes used for nesting strata. So this is something that people would be actively harvesting in a grassland bird type field. And after 28 days, the feed value, the nutrient value really begins decreasing. So if it takes birds 31 days to successfully fledge young, but the fields are being cut every 25, 28 days, you're not going to have many young be fledged. And so the most base level grassland bird conservation concept is to not cut when the birds are nesting. That tends to be between, as I said, June 1st and the last weeks of July, beginning of August. Savannah sparrow in red, bobolink in blue, in purple. They both begin nest initiation in late May and then appear by around August 3rd, or first week in August. Almost all the birds have fledged. So you just don't want to cut during this window. Not all fields are equal, so you can also try and prioritize where you might be able to avoid cutting, at least a little bit later in the season to allow time for some birds to fledge. And in this situation, you would want to try and delay the most open area field. This is obviously highly simplistic, but as a concept, you would want to try and delay the most open portion here, and then you would want to cut the area that has less of that interior space that the birds would be nesting in. So this was for the past couple decades. This has been like the ongoing grassland bird conservation in the Northeast, just not cutting. This is no longer really viable in a lot of sites. The reason grassland birds are called grasslands, or grassland birds are called grassland birds, because they need grass. But as fields are managed less heavily, they start to transition from graminoids, which are grasses and grass-like plants, to forbs, which are flowers and basically any flowering plant that's not a grass. And they won't nest in forb-dominated habitat. They really appear to like about 50% grass cover as an absolute minimum, but this is still a relatively new issue because historically fields have just not been as invasive ridden as they are now. Also, it was much less common for a field to go uncut between May and October than it is now. And as people are trying to manage their fields for birds, which tend to have much lower nutrient content in their hay, the number of farmers are also decreasing. And so now there's less people to cut the fields, and people that aren't cutting fields might be more choosy and not want to cut fields that are being delay mowed for grassland birds. That causes the fields to get inundated with flowers and other forbs, which in turn makes the quality of the habitat less for the birds breeding there. And then eventually the birds will disappear from the site, even if the field is not being cut during the breeding period. And so I think it's really important to understand now that going forward, grassland bird management really has to have an active management component, and an active invasive plant process to try and avoid them from getting established. Because once invasive plants are established, they're really hard to get rid of. Some of the main problem plants we see in grasslands are smooth bedstraw, knapweed, and poison parsnip. These are all plants that will dominate, take over, and replace grasses. And when you don't have the grasses, you don't have the correct nesting strata to build and hide a nest in. So once these plants come in and create large stands and large monocultures, they become very unsuitable habitat. So just to look at what suitable habitat looks like, regular management, majority is non-native grasses. The birds really don't care about native versus non-native. It's all grass versus non-grass. So a lot of our pastures have non-native grasses. That's totally fine. You might even have a couple legumes or flowers mixed in here, but again, bulk grasses. Once invasive plant begins to establish, it really starts taking over. So this is all smooth bedstraw, all of this white cotton candy-like flowering. And you see it's really getting to be in the middle of the field here. This would be a great opportunity to try and manage the invasive plant here before it's invaded the entire field. Once you go a couple of years with limited management, maybe not managing until October, or maybe not even cutting your field at all, you start seeing a lot more flowers coming in. In this case, it is goldenrod and milkweed, which are native. But again, the birds don't care about native versus non-native. It's the fact that it is a flower. And this is going to be very much a degraded habitat for a bobolink. Might be great for a field sparrow or a song sparrow, but if you're a bobolink or a savanna sparrow, this is teetering on the edge of unsuitable for breeding. And then eventually, woody plants come in, dogwoods and buckthorn and other woody plants, and then this becomes essentially unusable. Any birds that are here are probably pushed from other fields and just waiting and buying time until they migrate south, or maybe birds that were trying to nest here for the past 5 years, and now it's just gotten to a point where they're having low nest success, and they're just trying here because this is where they always breed. But by the time it's here, it's essentially lost grassland bird habitat and would really require a full field rejuvenation to get back to being good quality habitat. So if you are a grassland landowner or land manager, you really want to try and be proactive with preventing the establishment of invasive plants, and especially preventing them from establishing in the field center. This is a field I went out to last year, and I basically walked the edge of a wild carrot invasion. And then there's also some poison parsnip coming up here. And this is the opportunity you really want to act, and act heavily, to try and cut this frequently to prevent it from seeding and try and prevent it from getting established. Right now, it's still manageable. You could probably try and manage it with only minimal impact to the birds that are nesting in the field interior. So one of the first suggestions I make is to maintain a moat around your field, for lack of a better word. This a lot of time a invasive plant starts from the edge, and if you are maintaining a meter or two mowed path around your field, you're really slowing any vegetative growth it can make into the field interior. So maintaining a mowed path can do a lot to prevent a invasion from occurring. You also want to really monitor your field for invasive plants. The earlier you get on it, you might be able to go out and spot treat it. You might be able to only have to go and cut a couple hundred square yards, or maybe even less if you catch it early. If you're not looking for it and it goes several years without being observed, and then you see it, it's probably too late and it's probably already taken over large portions of field. As I said, act quickly to prevent it from spreading into the interior. The whole goal is to keep it out of the prime interior nesting habitat and just trying to keep beating it back to the edge, which is a tall order, and you'll probably never eradicate it 100% without like reseeding the field. But just trying to reduce the impact of it on the field interior goes a long way. You want to cut fields. If you do a early season cut, you want to cut your field before May 27th. That will allow birds that were trying to nest in your field time to go and re-nest elsewhere, and perhaps allow your field enough time to provide nesting habitat for birds that might relocate later in the year. Um, and you don't want to wait too late in the year to mow a second time. And if you only mow once, mow a little on the earlier side than maybe you think you need to. Historically, we've said not to mow until August 1st. That's still great if you don't have invasive plants. But if you're starting to get invasive plants coming in, consider mowing up to July 15th or maybe even earlier if you're really trying to fight back invasives. By then, a good amount of birds will have already fledged. A lot of them will be able to avoid farm equipment, and it'll likely be better for the long-term population to maintain healthy habitat into the future than to make sure that the last 10% of nests are able to fledge. And then also consider soil amendments. A lot of people that are managing grasslands for grassland birds are not making income off it. And a lot of times it can be hard to invest in a field you're not making money off of. But I think when you're taking a lot of grasses away and not doing things like adding calcium or lime, the soil quality really begins to degrade, which makes invasive plants a lot more competitive. Part of the reason invasive plants do as well as they do is because they can thrive in acidic conditions, whereas grasses like the forage grasses, the birds like really benefit from some more calcium. So if you have the means to, it's worth doing a soil test, maybe with UVM extension or local conservation district, and then considering some type of amendment for either magnesium or calcium, whatever they might recommend. And just a look at what it looks like trying to prevent the field from getting inundated. Um, this is not to scale. This is from some other research with bobolinks. But basically the interior 100 meters, all the area 100 meters or more from the edge, in some fields is like only 9% of the total area of the field, but 40% of the nests were in there. And as you get closer to the edge, you start having a larger percentage of the total habitat, but a smaller percentage of the nests. And so this is from that same field I just showed you the map of, and this is the carrots encroaching in from the edge. And so you can see a pretty clear demarcation between where the invasive plant isn't and where it is. And so this is the opportunity to act to where it is and prevent it from getting worse. Once your field is fully invaded, honestly, your options get a little more limited and definitely a little more costly. The first thing to do is to just determine the extent of the invasion. If you are able to only manage invasive plants on half your field because only half of it's invaded, you want to do that. But assuming by now like that opportunity is kind of uh, gone past, the next thing you want to do is to just try and cut your field several times to prevent invasive plants from seeding. This is the opposite of what you want to do to encourage grassland bird breeding. But if the grassland birds aren't going to nest in your field regardless, because it's become heavily invaded with plants, you really don't have a whole ton to lose by cutting more frequently. Um, Cutting more frequently might also help dissuade birds from nesting in a field that might get cut during the peak breeding season. So if you are going to manage for invasive plants and you're like, oh, I'm going to have to cut my field in mid-June, you might want to try and cut earlier in the year as well so birds don't try breeding in your field, having their nest destroyed too late in the season to re-nest elsewhere, and then not having a chance to breed. So if you are thinking you're gonna have to cut your field sometime in mid-June, it might be worth also doing a slightly earlier cut, just trying to dissuade any birds from establishing a territory there. And then another issue that kind of goes hand in hand in that with that is just general field abandonment. This is happening more and more often, I think, where people have had a hayfield and for all the reasons I've touched on before, are now not able to get it cut, whether it be a farmer is not in the region or available to cut their fields, or maybe they just want to just let it go for a wildflower meadow. That's great, but a wildflower meadow that's full of invasive plants really isn't that great. And so if you're going to have a grassland, you really do want to try and keep up with it to try and keep it in either grassland or transition it to more of like a wildflower meadow with native plants. When you don't touch your field at all and you just let it go, it can be it can be a pretty vicious cycle. So as I mentioned, the grasses will disappear and the perennial plants like the goldenrods and invasive species will show up. You start getting more and more woody invasive species, and the fields become more acidic because the calcium gets depleted by uh, either the invasive plants or the removal of grasses. If you leave your fields go without ever tending to them, large rocks might get brought to the surface through frost, which then makes it even harder to get it back into a hayfield-like condition. And it's just a vicious cycle. So you want to try and stay on top of it, or else it might get too out of hand and become essentially a massive money pit if you were ever to try and bring it back to a grassland habitat. So once a field is lost, it's pretty well and good lost because we are not establishing much new grassland habitat in Vermont, and especially not for grassland birds. I'm just going to go back to this one map here. Just again, highlighting some of the counties in Vermont that have the highest capacity for grassland bird conservation and tying it back to what I just said, that our habitat is, we're not making much new habitat. Our grassland bird habitat that we have now is kind of what we're working with. And to ensure that we are taking advantage of our future conservation opportunities, it's really important that we maintain these grassland habitats in a usable state. I want to give a quick plug to my own project and just talk about this for a second. Um, we started our Grassland Bird Ambassador Project over 10 years ago. A lot of times, research is very important, but also people just need advice on what to do. So I try and work with landowners to come out, map their vegetation, like I showed you those maps earlier, and try and give landowners advice on how to manage grassland birds that will both benefit the birds, but also meet the landowners' goals. I think there's a lot of opportunities for grassland bird conservation in existing agriculture. It's all about finding a middle ground that works for the landowner, farmer, and the birds. And I know I'm not going to come and shame a farmer for not managing their birds for their fields for grassland birds. I just really enjoy trying to work out ways that everyone can win. I currently have some funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to go out and meet with landowners to do this vegetation work, and then also try and give them more individualized management advice beyond just saying to not cut during the breeding season, because frankly, that's just not a realistic, long-term, viable conservation solution for grassland birds. A couple things you might be able to do to integrate grassland bird conservation into a existing management regime. I'll go back to this slide quickly. Is to try and be smart about where you might be rotating, for instance, uh, pasture animals. Imagine this was broken into smaller pastures. I could come out and maybe identify this is the best 100-meter by 100-meter portion of field. Bring your horses here in mid-May and then don't rotate them back here until early July. Really trying to just avoid where the birds might be nesting heaviest by rotating around the pasture, letting the birds do their thing, and then coming in after the breeding season. I think there might also be potential for farmers who are cutting somewhat early to still provide bird habitat, especially when there's invasive plants coming in and there needs to be a heavier hand for management. So I'm really eager to get out and visit more people and learn from them and see if they have concepts or strategies for providing far wildlife on farm wildlife habitat. Couple of resources I have. If you want to email me, these are on our website as well. I have like a nesting calendar that just kind of runs through the basic outline of the bobolink breeding cycle. Every year it's pretty similar. This is one of the concerns we have with them is people are cutting their fields earlier and earlier each year, but bobolinks are not responding to climate change by arriving earlier. And so there is going to be some mismatch with their management and their arrival times. This just kind of helps you understand where bird might be in its breeding cycle. So if you are going to manage, you can try and manage around that. This is a pamphlet. I'm happy to mail one out to you or a couple out to your group if you're interested in handing them out. It just has some basic information on the management timing, on some mowing strategies you can use to try and reduce any potential mortality of either nests or nestlings. And it has my contact info on there if you want to give it to a neighbor or something in case they're interested in reaching out. And also, we just have a sheet that has some of the priority species, what species we're looking for, and on the back side, it has some of the common lookalikes, so you might be able to see what you have on your farm or in your local pasture. One of the major issues with grassland bird conservation is that it is a constant money sink. With some species, like ones that might nest in a forest, you just kind of set the forest aside and just let it go. But as I mentioned, you have to manage grasslands, or else they're not going to be grasslands anymore. And in Vermont, we're not really doing any burning of our grasslands. We are really doing everything mechanically. And so there are some programs in Vermont that can offer funding to landowners to help offset financial losses incurred by delay mowing. Especially if you're a farmer and you might not be able to cut your grass early enough, there might be, as I said, a financial loss incurred by the foregone income. I will say that for some of them, it is not nearly enough to completely offset incurred costs. That's a massive issue, and I fully understand that these are not going to work for everyone, but they can be opportunities to pursue. So two of them are from NRCS. EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, has a delay mowing and I think a rotational grazing program that can help compensate you for your work. CSP is a similar program that I would check with your local NRCS office about if you're interested in more of that information. The Bobolink Project is administered by Massachusetts Audubon and then Vermont Audubon up here. Unlike the NRCS programs, that's the Bobolink Project is fully donor funded. Is one of the first of the type where donors could basically offer money to landowners to bid a contract on this is the minimal amount I need to conserve my habitat for birds. This in general does offer less than the NRCS projects, but being that it's not a government contract, some people say that there's a lot less red tape, and so it might be a good starting point. And also just conservation commissions have done some fundraising if they maybe have a local bobolink field that the farmer has been cutting really heavily. Maybe the farmer's about to retire and you're looking for someone new to come take over the field. Maybe you can raise some funding to try and encourage the next person to mow it in a more grassland bird friendly way. A lot of times, I think people that live in a town are much more receptive to their neighbors talking to them than someone like me coming in from, afar and talking down on them and not understanding, or them thinking I don't understand the perspective, and probably I don't always understand the perspective. So any local involvement can be great, even if that's giving me someone's contact info and saying they might be interested, shoot them an email. I'm happy to help with that type of stuff. And I also want to give a shout out to the full life cycle conservation plan for bobolinks. This was developed by VCE as a lead, but through many international partnerships and domestic partnerships. Roz Renfrew, who's a co-founder of my place of work, Vermont Center for Ecostudies, and is a leading grassland bird biologist. She now is the head of the wildlife diversity department at Vermont Fish and Game, which is the non-game conservation program. We really couldn't have a better conservation partner and wildlife partner and fish and wildlife than her. And this is just an incredible resource. A lot of the maps I used came from this. And if you really just want a full understanding of bobolink conservation and a really holistic view at the social and economic and environmental issues that bobolinks experience and some of the major hangups for their conservation, I'd say this would be the first resource that I would suggest you go look at. And then just if you're interested in any of our social medias or anything, or check us out. We do monthly field notes, so just a short snippet of some of the ongoings in the natural world each year, maybe what birds returning or what insects might be emerging. We also do some e-news, so just monthly updates of some of our research projects. And I'll go back quickly to just my email address. If you or someone wants to talk about doing a landowner visit or a site visit, shoot me an email. I'm always happy to talk and come out to visit folks. And I thank you so much for listening to me ramble about grassland birds. And I'm more than happy to take some questions and stuff. We got a little bit of time, and yeah, just thank you for listening. And I hope you learned something and can take something away from this.
Thanks, Kevin. That was great. Why don't you see if there are any questions in the chat? I'm not seeing anything yet. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I want to say I really appreciated the video, even though it was older, of the flocks
Oh yeah.
that they gather down. You know, you just don't think about what they're doing when they're south. We know they're south, but we don't really think about how they use the habitat down there. So that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's been in the recent years a real focus on this full life cycle ecology. So it's been so easy to conserve, your backyard forest for your black-throated blue warbler, but if you're not conserving it throughout the entire life cycle, you're really not doing a good job of it. And so that's part of the reason for that bobbling life cycle conservation plan, because people are increasingly recognizing that.
Yeah, it's important to do what we do here, but it's important to think about when they're there. That's really great. I
And
will
I
say
think
too, this. Oh, go ahead, Kevin. I'm sorry.
I think also, like, because bobolink are so threatened on their breeding grounds, that's like, and their breeding grounds is something we have really direct control over. It's also a great opportunity for the the human involvement, which in some ecosystems is not always what is best needed. But also, if you're conserving where they are breeding, you're also conserving where their nestlings are starting their life, and that's integral to them surviving their 7,000-mile migration. So it goes beyond just providing breeding habitat. It provides the basis of them to survive to adulthood and breed again.
So let me ask you a question. You know, so I live in the Champlain Valley and I have my little jogging route and so I bird while I jog. And I have some great fields where the bobolink are and I'm like, "Oh, the bobolink are here." I'm so excited. And then 2 days later I'm heading out and they've cut the fields,
Mm.
right? Is there, as you know, you have your grassland bird ambassadors, you know, with coverts, we have our bear ambassadors. What is your suggestion? Is there a way I could approach those landowners, or should I send those, that field to you so maybe you could approach those landowners? What are some strategies?
I think it's gonna depend on. I think you kind of get a sense of some landowners if that's something they're open to. It's been increasingly hard to approach farmers, asking them to forego income to not cut grasslands. Um, Through no fault of their own. It's just so expensive. So I'd say you can definitely give them my info. I would say sometimes I might be hesitant to just walk up to the farmer and start, you know, asking them to make less money in some ways. And so I think that one of the really important things is taking the opportunity to conserve things when you can, and also recognizing that in some ways it's not great when habitat's destroyed. But if that habitat wasn't destroyed there, it would have probably been destroyed elsewhere. And
Mm.
then there would have been the extra cost of like the carbon cost of having to bring it to Vermont from New York or wherever. So that's not really a happy answer to your question. I guess my answer is there's not a good answer to that. It just is really because it's such an economic thing, it makes it really hard to just approach people about it.
I figured that was your answer, but I had to test you. I was wondering
Yes.
what you might say or what the other options might be. I
Yeah.
will say also on this calendar that's currently on the screen for those that are looking, um, it's fascinating. I have a landowner that says she lives by this calendar and she can feel like she's a soothsayer because she'll be like, "Oh, the bobolinks are going to come back this week, the males." And sure enough, they seem to show up in her field that first week in May. So if you do have grassland birds and you are looking for the bobolinks to return, you should either take a photograph of this or ask Kevin for that brochure that he suggested he could send to you because it's a really great little calendar to stick up when you're looking for those bobolinks.
I think this is the 2023 one. We are in the midst of getting a 2026 one. Maybe we do update this every year. I just have
How
not
much does it
updated.
shift?
I mean, it doesn't shift. It's more just getting the dates, so the dates line up with,
Ah,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, I
But
see.
in general, it's like, yeah, the last week of May. But um, yeah, it's pretty. They rely on like the solar period to determine when they want to leave from South
Mm.
America. So they're
Hmm.
set in stone. Um, they have no idea what's going on up here during the time of year. So as the seasons get earlier here, they're arriving at what's essentially a later point in the spring. Um, which that's called phenological mismatch.
Hmm.
For
Hmm.
our extreme long distance migrants, that's a concern if things like, your insects that you rely on or seeds you rely on are not popping up at the same time maybe they used to. And for these birds, a lot of it's like the management's happening at different time, usually earlier.
Interesting. Interesting. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. We'll give it another minute or so. And is there any last minute thoughts that you want to add, Kevin, while we're waiting to see if anybody has a burning question?
Uh, no, I just thank you so much for listening. And like I said, I really hope that people will reach out to me. And even if it's just to learn more and, maybe they're not in a situation to change their management now, but they want to know what they could do, what their options would be. Let me know. It's a no obligation, guilt-free interaction. So I love hearing from farmers and just hearing your experience as well, of maybe what won't work for you. Just anything I can do to understand the land aspect better is something I'm always really eager to learn more about.
That's great. Yeah, it's really fun. The best part of all these is getting out in the field, meeting with these landowners, and even if they don't have what you're looking for. I was fascinated. I know about poison parsnip, but I hadn't really thought much about bedstraw or the knapweed. I actually
Mm.
wasn't familiar with that one myself. I deal more with the forested areas, so I'm thinking more, honeysuckle, barberry, buckthorn.
Yeah, we get whatever you see on in the margins of I-89, that's what you find in hayfields. Yeah. It seems like just the roads or avenues for invasive plant spread, and you increasingly have one farmer that might mow 10 people and one person gets it, it spreads everywhere. So in the past 5 years, that's probably become like the number one subject I feel like I talk about when I'm talking about grassland birds.
It's interesting because I would say too, we didn't add invasive species to the coverage training till about 12 years ago,
Mhm.
and when it was like that jump, all of a sudden it was the topic of conversation all around. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's great if people think of these things when managing their woods or their grasslands. It's really important to really have that in their mindset of what they're doing to improve biodiversity overall.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Kevin, thank you so much for your time. And we'll look to, I do want to point out, give me a second, on June 13th, Kevin's
Yeah.
going to be joining us at a landowner in Rochester who has forest and field, and their field is a haven. It's the one I told you who likes to predict the bobolinks. We're going to do a grassland walk there, talk about grassland management, and of course, do some grassland birding. So that's going to be
Yes.
June 13th, Saturday, June 13th in Rochester. So that will be in the Coverts e-news. If you're not already signed up for the Coverts e-news, go ahead and do that online on our website. You can do that. And hopefully maybe we'll see some of you on the 13th.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for coming out. It was great talking.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.